Interestingly, the literary structure, that is the way Genesis 12 through 50 is arranged, is not according to that threefold division. In other words, we don't have the first part of the story is about Abraham, and the second part of the story is about Isaac, and the third part of the story is about Jacob. That's not what we have in Genesis 12 through 50. Rather, we have 3 cycles of tales. Cycle, of course, is a circle, and it's just a term we use for kind of a strung together series of stories. Not actually one story, but a lot of different stories, all of which concern a single individual. So we've got 3 cycles of stories. The first cycle, of course, focuses on Abraham. And this is the one we're going to read and talk about a lot in class. And that's chapters 12 through 24. Now, we already said that Abraham's son, chosen son, special son, is Isaac. But the second cycle of tales is not the Isaac one. Rather, it's a Jacob cycle. And since Abraham is Isaac's father and Isaac is Jacob's father, what we have is half of Isaac's story is in Abraham and half of Isaac's story is in Jacob. How come Isaac doesn't get his own cycle? The reason Isaac doesn't get his own cycle is because Isaac is a wimp. He's a very weak personality and pretty much does whatever other people make him do. Because he's a very passive individual. So his personality is not strong enough to merit its own cycle, but Abraham and Jacob certainly is. And then, as we said, Jacob has 12 sons. The final cycle, well, let me say, this one is 25 through 36. And the final cycle is the Joseph cycle. Joseph is the second youngest of Jacob's sons. So the last one actually focuses on Joseph. And this, I wish we had time to read it in class, is a very exciting story. It's actually been called by many critics a novella. That is a short novel. Because this one hangs together as a single story of betrayal and family rivalry and jealousy and somebody rising up from the lowest point in Egyptian society to become the second in command, more powerful than anyone except the Pharaoh. Deception of brothers, proving loyalty. It's a wonderful story. But the focus of the last part of the book, which is 37 through 50, is Joseph, although Jacob is alive until the very end of the book of Genesis. And their other brothers also have their moment in the lights. But for the most part, the focus is on Joseph. Okay, I have one more thing I want to cover about the ancestors, and it will be rather detailed. This will be more of a thematic structure of the ancestral narratives. I've given you a family structure, the way they're all related familially, and I've given you a literary structure, the way the passages we call the ancestral narratives is arranged, and now I want to give you a thematic, or even we can call it a theological structure. What is it about? What concern do all of these stories have in these 3 ancestral cycles in common? And what they have in common can be capsulized in a single word, and that word is covenant. Not the first covenant in the Bible, but it is certainly the first covenant that's made with a single part of humanity. The covenants in Genesis 1 through 11, and there is in fact kind of an unspoken covenant with Adam and Eve. There's a covenant with Cain. There's a covenant with Noah. All of those covenants represent all of humanity. But now Yahweh seems to have shown a little bit of preference, a little bit of favoritism, and he's locked into this particular family, and he makes a covenant with them. What's a covenant? Well, it's a word, and of course we're using an English word here for a Hebrew word. I won't have you know the Hebrew word, but it would look something like this in English characters. Brit is the way you'd say it, or berith. It's a contract. A covenant is a contract between 2 parties or individuals. However, it's more than a contract because it implies not only kind of the formal, serious legal relationships of a contract, but it also has to do with an establishment of a relationship. So the word contract in English doesn't quite catch it. Another word that's been, try a lot of English words, see which ones fit. Another one that was tried is testament, as in last will and testament. It has that element in it as well, of this kind of a formal legal document. Another one is kind of a comparison to marriage. But it's a formal relationship. Human beings can have it with other human beings, or human beings can have it with gods. Nations can have it with nations. They're all covenants. And in the verb that's used in Hebrew, it's not usually translated into English, is not to make a covenant, but rather to cut a covenant. And you'll see the passage where this takes place, even though you won't read the English word cut, you'll read make. In that when two individuals make a covenant, what is customary is to cut a sacrificial animal in pieces, separate it in half. And then both parties to the covenant will walk in between the two severed pieces of the animal. It's probably very disgusting. And they make a vow. And the vow is, may the gods do to us what has been done to these animals if we break this covenant. The oath of office that somebody takes when they are elected to some position, or the oath that's sworn when somebody is going to give testimony before a court, are all kind of vestiges or remains of this whole idea of cutting a covenant. So, God makes a covenant with Abraham, and this covenant constitutes Israelite self-identity. When Israelites think of who they are in relation to the other nations, they think about it in terms of this covenant that Yahweh has made with Abraham and his children. So, remember, I'm talking about theologic or thematic unity in the ancestral narratives. And the ancestral narratives, for the most part, there are exceptions to this, but the ancestral narratives, for the most part, are primarily concerned with who receives the covenant. First, let's take a look at where the covenant begins. And this is also in Genesis, the 12th chapter, page 16 in the Oxford Annotated. And we have conditions. Usually when you make a contract, there are conditions to both parties, both things that they both have to do. And here they are, chapter 12, verse 1. Now Yahweh said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. We have to figure the full import of that. In the ancient world, there weren't real unified and structured police systems. So pretty much the only thing that prevented your neighbor from breaking into your house and stealing your women and all of your food stored and kill you, the only thing that prevents that from happening is the fact that he knows that if he does that, your family will defend you. So a human being cut loose from his family or her family is without defense. So Yahweh is, in essence, asking Abraham to leave everything that makes him safe and secure. That is Abraham's part of the contract. Abraham is commanded to leave his homeland. And I will not read this, but subsequently in chapter 17 of Genesis, he's also commanded to circumcise all the male members of his household. I once had a student, when I said this, raise her hand, young woman, raise her hand in my class and ask me, what is circumcision? And she was very embarrassed when I answered her directly, so now I always tell my classes exactly what it is. I realize most of you know, but there's a flap of skin on the tip of the penis when a baby is born, and it's called the foreskin. And what Abraham was required to do was to cut off this foreskin on every male member of the household. Why does this become a sign of the covenant? It never says. My theory is that it has something to do with the fact that the penis is the male generative organ, and God has his sign on that part of the individual. But that's just my guess. I'd be glad to talk about that further. That's the human's part. That's Abraham's part. Now this is God's part. Verse 2, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So if we could understand God's part, there's a lot of abstract theological language there. It's to make Abraham a great nation. Now the word great can, and I think does, mean two possible things. I think it means both of them, in fact. It could mean a numerous nation, a lot of people, and when we see in Exodus, the beginning of Exodus, we'll see that's exactly what takes place. It could also mean powerful. So Yahweh is promising to this single individual, leader of a relatively small family household, maybe 60 or 70 people, maybe at the peak of his power, Abraham had maybe 150 people in his household, including servants, and promising him that he's going to be a great nation. And then further, we see added to that promise, and I read this to you already in verse 7, is a promise of a particular land. So the deal is, this is the covenant. If Abraham leaves his homeland, and ultimately if he circumcises the male members of his household, then God promises to make of his descendants a great nation, a powerful nation, and give him the land of Canaan. That's the deal. So what happens? Remember, the issue is who? We already know it's going to be Abraham and Sarah, because that's said very clearly in the first cycle of stories, the Abraham cycle. But how about after him? I already mentioned to you that Abraham had two sons, one through Hagar, his mistress, and one through Sarah, his more formal and favorite wife. So which son? The obvious answer would be the oldest son. Ishmael is the oldest son. So that's where the tension is, because of course everybody who's telling this story and reading this story knows that it can't possibly come through Ishmael, because then the Israelites will not be the chosen people. Of course, when the Islamic holy book, the Quran, retells this story, they say that the promise came through Ishmael. And the reason for that is all Arabs identify themselves as the child of Abraham through Ishmael. So a little disagreement on interpretation of this ancient story. So who is it going to be? Well, the first problem is that Abraham doesn't have any children. He and his wife are incapable of bearing children. So Abraham goes on for decades waiting for this promise to be fulfilled. He doesn't own a lick of land that Yahweh has promised to him, and he doesn't even have a child. And finally he says he's going to give it to his servant. He's going to turn the promise, turn the inheritance over to his trusted servant. But God assures him it's going to be a child of his. So first there's no child, then there's two children, then God says it's going to be Isaac and not Ishmael, and then God, and this is, we'll spend some time on this passage in class, Genesis 22, God orders Abraham to kill the child who he already said is going to bear the promise. So the question of who just becomes intensified, because we breathe a big sigh of relief when Isaac is finally born and we know that Abraham and Sarah have a child. And then God orders the child to be killed. So the tension just shoots up through the ceiling again. Then, of course, we'll read the story, or you'll read it at home, and we'll talk about it in class. Isaac is miraculously relieved of the responsibility of dying, and then he has children, but he has twins. He has Jacob and Esau. And once again, the question is who? And the promise is made at their birth, according to the narrative, that the older will serve the younger. So it looks like it's going to be Jacob because he's the younger. But Isaac favors Esau. And so there's the tension again. And Jacob manages twice to trick first Isaac and then his brother and win the birthright and the promise. Then finally, Jacob has 12 sons. And here the pattern breaks. Because all of the 12 sons are eponymous ancestors of Israel. Each of them represent one of the 12 tribes. So is it going to be one of the sons, or is it going to be all of the sons? And there's no one answer to that. There's actually three answers. In one sense, all the sons. Because Jacob is renamed Israel. So he is the eponymous ancestor of the entire nation, which bears the promise, which has become a great nation, which has possessed the land. So therefore all the sons inherit the promise. However, we also have an oldest son, and that's Reuben. Because there is a tradition in ancient Israel that the oldest will inherit. So Reuben is the oldest son, and he's disqualified in a kind of a chopped up, censored story. I'd love to get more information on this. He sleeps with one of his father's wives, and as a result his father cuts him off. Then we have the next two oldest sons, who are Levi and Simeon. I won't write these down. Well, I wrote that down. Levi and Simeon. And they're disqualified because they murder an entire village. And that's a long story that I don't want to get into right now. But they move into a village and they murder them and make Jacob's reputation in the region. Keep in mind, they still don't own any land. So they have to keep on the good side of the inhabitants of the land, or they'll be kicked out or killed. So they slaughter an entire village at a time when all of the male members of the village were indisposed. This is Genesis 38 if you're curious about how they were indisposed and why. It's rather odd, believe me. Anyway, all the male members of the village are indisposed. Levi and Simeon go into the village with their swords and kill every man, woman, and child in the entire village. So they're disqualified. The next oldest is Judah. And in fact, Judah has a prominent position among the tribes in Israel. And as we said, King David, the greatest king in Israel's history, comes from the tribe of Judah. However, we run all the way down. I told you that the last cycle is the cycle of Joseph. And Joseph is the second youngest. So he also seems to be a special bearer of the promise. Remember I said there were three choices. One choice, all sons. Other choice, Judah, because of his unique position in the time. And finally, Joseph. And the reason for Joseph is because there is no tribe of Joseph in Israel. Joseph has two sons. One of them is named Manasseh, and the other is named Ephraim. I will not hold you responsible, for all these names. I'll only hold you responsible for Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph and Judah. Just know vaguely about those guys and the wives, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, but not any of these sons. Don't worry about those. And I want you to just know it in context. We'll talk more about that later. Anyway, Joseph had two sons, and both of these sons are tribes. So Joseph is not really an eponymous ancestor, but his two sons are. Now what does that mean? Jacob adopted his two grandsons as if they were his own sons. So, whereas all of the other 11 sons get one portion of the inheritance, Joseph gets two portions. So by Jacob adopting Joseph's sons as his own, Jacob was in fact giving Joseph a double portion of the inheritance, giving him the most prominent part. So those are the three possible answers as to where it goes by the end of Genesis. But by the time we get to the book of Exodus, which will be the third tape, what we're going to see then is that the entirety of the nation of Israel is regarded together as sharing the promise and the destiny which was given by Yahweh to Abraham, passed down through the generations until finally at the beginning of Exodus we get a great nation. And that will be the end of our tape for today. Thank you very much.